In this video, I will discuss perspectives on attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD, and treatments that you may not have heard about before, so that you can... Is that a squirrel? Squirrel. Yeah, no, I don't know. Wait, where was I? Something about ACDC, right? No, never mind. ADHD. So you can make an informed decision about treatment options such as medication or more natural alternative approaches, and even address the question of whether ADHD is a real condition or just some crazy excuse for undisciplined behavior. I'm Dr. Alistair Taylor, a licensed clinical psychologist, and this is my ADHD shirt. In my view, ADHD is one of the least understood and most over-applied labels that is put on people these days. Unfortunately, left to run its course, in worst-case scenarios, ADHD can have some very negative outcomes. Conversely, however, if you understand it and intervene, preferably early on, you can channel ADHD-ness into very positive outcomes. Let's take a look at how. So if you have a child who may have ADHD or has a diagnosis of ADHD, you may be agonizing over the decision to put them on stimulant medication, or perhaps withdraw medication if they're already on it. This is a valid concern, as while stimulant medications are pretty safe when used as prescribed, they, along with perhaps all drugs, are not without risks or side effects. Furthermore, it is a legitimately scary thought to be medicating your child to fit them into a rigid system that often fails to take into account the nature of children or the uniqueness of some children. It is somewhat alarming that children as young as 4 or 5 years old are being prescribed stimulant medication, which suggests a sort of desperate urgency to fix a child when there is still such rapid development of the brain. One 2016 study in the Journal of the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry, for example, showed that about half of the 1,200 respondents to a survey on stimulant medication use that started by age 9 had already been using stimulant medication for 6 years. The same study showed, however, that earlier prescription and longer use of ADHD medication was associated with a lower risk of adolescent or later life substance use. This is not to say that it is a cause and effect relationship, just an association, as it is also possible that earlier exposure to illicit substances could provoke some ADHD-like symptoms, then lead to a diagnosis and prescription. In summary, the link between ADHD and medication and substance use is unclear, with some studies suggesting that the medications have a protective effect and others saying the opposite. Of course, stimulant medications themselves are abused and taken without prescription. However, I think you could make the case that speaks more to a broken social and educational system rather than something about the medication itself. After all, in abuse cases, these medications are taken voluntarily. One possible factor to consider here is that if stimulant medications facilitate a more well-behaved child who does better in school and at home, there may be a marked shift from consistent negative reinforcement to more positive reinforcement, which could lead to a happier child and less of the "I'm not good enough" feelings that erode self-esteem and may contribute to substance use in later years. In my experience as a clinician, and also in agreement with some data, it does seem that stimulant medications really do help some kids at school. However, it is also possible that medication is a symptom-based treatment and does not address some of the causes of ADHD, which is what I want to talk about here. As with many medications, they are often more about symptom management than a cure for the condition, and may not address the root causes of the condition. Beyond this, there are also valid concerns around stimulant side effects and long-term safety outcomes. To start with the diagnostic criteria for ADHD, it is worth noting that there are over 20 items, almost all of which describe behaviors visible to others, but don't really reference the child's internal experience. If you think about it further, many of the symptoms of ADHD are similar to what we experience as adults if we are very anxious. Difficulty concentrating, not following through on tasks, and feeling physically restless. Furthermore, anxiety is fundamentally a condition of expecting things to go wrong and not having the feeling that you can control those things. I'm not saying that ADHD is an anxiety disorder, but given that children often struggle to communicate their internal experiences very effectively, the symptoms of anxiety may reflect a general sense of unease. This, in turn, could stem from various sources such as social or academic difficulty at school, domestic issues like parents who are constantly fighting, or more subtle cues such as inattentive parents. You might want to watch the still face experiment linked below if you think a sometimes inattentive parent is not a big deal. In this video, a mom and infant are seated facing each other and engaging happily. Then the mom turns away, looks back at the child with a blank facial expression, and stares. This makes the infant uncomfortable, and the effect is immediate. For the next minute, the infant tries in vain to recapture mom's attention, and the infant soon devolves into physical distress and crying. Bear in mind that the mom is not threatening in any way. She is simply disconnected, which provokes immediate anxiety in the child. At that moment, the child is oblivious to everything else in their world and physically agitated. Rings a bell, right? Isn't that what ADHD essentially looks like? This response makes perfect sense from a survival perspective. At that age, and for years after, the child is 100% dependent on the parent's support, care, and attention. Anything less is a scary thought that implies abandonment and rejection. This is also consistent with the implicit messaging in ADHD. It often entails a barrage of negative feedback such as pay attention, stop talking, sit still, stop doing that, don't do this. Essentially, it communicates a lot about doing something wrong or not doing enough right, implicitly communicating failure and possibly rejection. Genetic and temperamental factors also have a protective effect against negativity. Things may be fine in the perceived, or if the perceived criticism is balanced with a lot of love, nurturing, and encouragement. But for those who are more vulnerable, ADHD symptoms could emerge. It is also quite important to note that there is good evidence that prenatal factors such as emotional stress or depression during pregnancy can predispose the unborn child to ADHD. This again highlights the notion that an antidote to ADHD is the provision of a safe, secure environment from conception. Even though the developing baby has no conscious awareness of stress in the womb, the mother's circulating stress hormones cross the placenta and play a role in the developing infant's brain. If the above issues have some validity, it is a big subject to tackle, but for now, I just want to draw attention to the child's emotional security as a possible factor to consider before going straight to medication. A comprehensive psychological assessment is one way to investigate your child's emotional landscape. However, being checked in with and connected to your child can be an amazing start and may be enough. Getting them to talk about their feelings, sometimes through play and art, can be helpful. I will link some therapy-based books and board games below that can tap into your child's inner feelings in roundabout ways. If you'd like to watch my video on conflict resolution, it has suggestions on how to build a connection with someone who is upset and not feeling heard or understood. Another important layer to consider with ADHD is that context matters. Most of the diagnostic criteria relating to struggling to fit in apply to school or work. They also apply to social situations and the home. When we think about the largely cookie-cutter format of most schools and workplaces, they don't always accommodate different kids. Part of this may be the emphasis placed on academics as a sign of intelligence, and while this is partially true, there are a couple limitations to this type of thinking. One is that, at least in Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences, that there are several incarnations of this trait, such as bodily kinesthetic and interpersonal. Great athletes and social butterflies come to mind. Moreover, supposedly Simone Biles and Michael Phelps were diagnosed with ADHD, but were incredibly successful in their chosen domains. So sometimes we have to ask not only whether ADHD can be effectively modified, but is it an intrinsic part of the child's makeup that also constitutes a gift for success? Just not one that necessarily fits the classroom. Psychologist Robert Rosenthal conducted some interesting experiments on the influence of environmental feedback on both people and animals. In one that has since been dubbed the Pygmalion effect, a teacher at an elementary school was led to believe that some of the students in the class were what they called blossomers, or had exceptional abilities or exceptional potential based on a modified IQ test. In reality, these students were selected at random and essentially similar to their peers. After a year, the children were re-evaluated, and the blossomers had made significantly greater improvements than their peers, even though they were in the same classroom doing the same activities with the same curriculum. Since the teacher was not directed to provide any different type of teaching to either group, it was inferred that the teacher had subtly changed her interactions with the gifted group based on her expectations of how they would do better. As with almost any study, there has not been perfect replication, but many studies have supported these conclusions. Even more interestingly, a similar study was done on mice learning a maze running task, wherein one group of mice handlers was told that their mice were learning impaired, while the other group was told that their mice were maze bright or super learners. In reality, they were randomly selected mice and all about the same. But somehow, the mice described as fast learners did in fact outperform the other group. The fact that they were relatively simple-brained mice suggests that there is something performance-altering about how we are treated by others. And this, I think, raises some questions about ADHD, which is a disorder that is contextualized by its environment. In other words, being energetically restless in a classroom might be a gift in another situation, but the classroom lends itself to a pathological definition of a child's behavior, a lot of negative feedback, and possibly a corresponding sense in the child that he or she is a failure. The second limitation, in my view, is that with the emphasis on academics, I wonder sometimes if we are blindly following the veneration of science and technology without really considering the long-term outcomes. A few simple examples might be, for example, the one I had in mind was the invention of plastics. Cars, too, would be another example. Both solved some big problems when they were introduced, and both had and still do have definite value and utility. Both required a certain amount of education and genius to invent. However, on the flip side, some of the bigger issues we face on the planet today, such as plastic and microplastic pollution, and air pollution from cars, along with gridlock freeways and thousands of lost hours of family together time because parents are sitting in traffic for hours a day. These are indirect consequences of our progress. Other than rogue meteorites, perhaps the greatest existential threat to humanity lies in our own inventions, such as nuclear weapons, which are the unfortunate product of amazing science and technology. So, obviously, I'm not anti-education or anti-science. I have a doctorate degree, but I do think we need to proceed carefully when we try to force a child into a system that sometimes lacks wisdom and foresight, or the ability to ask, where does this technology lead to from, one generation from today? On top of this, it is one of life's great invalidations of another's uniqueness to unquestioningly suffocate their natural tendencies, energies, and interests, only to make them conform to a system that we arrogantly believe to be best for them and everyone else. If you were forced into compliance with something you didn't like, wouldn't you have a hard time focusing on what you're being forced to focus on, or squirm in your seat a little? And one more related point here is that how we label people, especially with something like the diagnosis, this can feel like a pejorative label. It can have a profound effect on an individual's moods and behaviors, analogous to a self-fulfilling prophecy. This can also manifest in ways that are more subtle than saying something like, he is just ADHD, rather than he displays some signs of ADHD, but also in statements such as he's just a slow learner, or a distraction, or terribly inattentive. Bear in mind that when children hear these statements, they lack the cognitive sophistication to understand their deeper meaning, or that the person saying it may not actually be malicious in intent, but it still sounds condescending. And with enough repetition, As is often the case with repeated negative or corrective feedback in ADHD, the line between doing bad, as in leading to a core belief about being a defective human, can become a blurry one. Now, in terms of the physiological aspects of ADHD, there is evidence that the brains of children with ADHD are slightly different than what we'd call neurotypical brains. Furthermore, since the mechanisms of action of stimulant medication are well understood and can have a positive effect, it seems logical to say that there are neurochemical differences in the brains of children with ADHD. However, medications are not the only tool that can favorably adjust brain chemistry. There are natural approaches that some prescribers may not be fully aware of. To clarify, I'm not prescribing anything here myself, but rather providing information for you to look into further and maybe talk with your child's pediatrician about and get second and third opinions on it if you're not satisfied with the answers to your questions. I want to preface the information on natural treatments for ADHD with a very basic biology lesson. You hear a lot about dopamine on social media these days. It's the primary neurotransmitter associated with ADHD and in general, motivation and reward-seeking behaviors. It is also the target molecule for drugs like cocaine, which is definitely not a treatment for ADHD, and when in excess in parts of the brain associated with schizophrenia. However, other neurotransmitter systems are also associated with ADHD, so this may explain why stimulant medications that target dopamine are not always effective. Stimulant medications also affect neuropeptide Y, which plays a role in appetite regulation and may explain loss of appetite and weight loss in those using stimulants. Secondly, when you hear people talking about dopamine or any other neurotransmitter, we have to know that there is a very complex system of upstream biological machinery at work before you even get to having a dopamine molecule. Dopamine is produced in the brain by various enzymes or proteins such as tyrosine hydroxylase, and the raw materials include the amino acids tyrosine and phenylalanine. Tyrosine hydroxylase, or TH, converts tyrosine into a compound called L-DOPA, the precursor to dopamine. So where does tyrosine hydroxylase come from? It is encoded from the TH gene. Anytime you have transcribing of genes and the building of new proteins from those genetic blueprints, you have to consider the wealth of nutrient complexity that regulates those processes. Genes are very strongly influenced not only by environmental factors like stress or lack of nurturing, but also by numerous nutrients in food, particularly the nutrients in what is known as the methylation cycle. These include, but are not limited to, vitamin B6, vitamin B12, folate, choline, and magnesium. I know I'm introducing some complex topics here, but I'll try to keep it as simple as possible because if you are dealing with prescription stimulants, it really helps to understand a bit about the bigger picture and not just a snapshot view that reduces ADHD to dopamine regulation. So methylation sounds like a really fancy word, and in the body, it actually is a crazily complex mechanism. But essentially what it is the process of a molecule known as SAMe, or S-adenosylmethionine, which donates a methyl group, which is just a carbon with 3 hydrogen atoms attached to it, and then donates it to another molecule. And if a methyl group is attached to a strand of DNA, it acts a bit like putting up a barrier on train tracks. You might think of the train tracks as the strands of DNA and the train as a transcription factor that reads the DNA as it drives down the tracks so you can get the blueprints for building new proteins, like the TH I just mentioned. But if there is an obstacle on the train tracks, the train stops and can't reach its final destination. So no DNA blueprints are read and no new proteins are built. Remember that methylation is very much nutrient dependent, so much so that the degree of methylation can determine whether you develop a disease like cancer, and certainly at a more subtle level influence your brain's chemistry, which in turn influences your moods and behaviors. Adding yet another layer of complexity to this, when transcription factors do bind to DNA, which might be compared to how a train is put on rails in the first place, they do so with the help of what are known as zinc fingers. As the name implies, these are zinc-dependent proteins that almost resemble a hand with fingers, which enables you to grab onto something. In this case, it is the transcription factor that binds to the DNA to read it out. If someone is deficient in zinc, they will also have lower levels of DNA being read and less building of new proteins for growth. This is one of the reasons why zinc deficiency is strongly related to impaired growth and development. And unfortunately, this also applies to the brain development too. Finally, another example of the importance of nutrients. Even if the genetic machinery is operating correctly and you have these construction elements that can build dopamine molecules, some of these molecules require cofactors such as iron, the spectrum of B vitamins, and vitamin C to function. Vitamin D also plays a role in regulating and optimizing dopamine levels, and vitamin D is in itself in a symbiotic relationship with magnesium and vitamin A. So you may also be wondering how relevant any of this is. Aren't most kids getting enough nutrients from food in the modern diet that is often enriched with vitamins anyway? Or what if they are supplemented with the multivitamin? Here the topic becomes a bit more nuanced. Vitamin deficiencies are not either-or equations and can exist on a spectrum. Subclinical vitamin C deficiency, which is, as I just mentioned, is critical to dopamine synthesis, is estimated to be anywhere from 20 to 40% of the population. Subclinical meaning that you have enough vitamin C to prevent scurvy or full-blown disease, but not enough to optimize all of your body's needs for it. Vitamin C is also an antioxidant, meaning that it helps quench the damaging effects of free radicals and toxins that harm the body or the cells in the body. But free radical activity varies significantly from one person to another, thus affecting the amount of vitamin C that we need. Smokers, for example, have much higher levels of free radicals from the ingestion of toxins in cigarette smoke, which is evidenced by such things as accelerated aging of the skin or cancer risk, and their need for vitamin C is thus higher in non-smokers than in general. However, many factors, even air pollution in a busy city, influence free radical activity, and many factors influence the amount of vitamin C we derive from food. So it's a complex picture. In short, nutritional deficiencies are more common than we might imagine, and if you take into account what I was saying about methylation and gene transcription relying heavily on nutrients such as vitamin B6 and B12 and the mineral zinc, and how some folks avoid foods like red meat, liver, and oysters, which are the most nutritionally dense sources of these nutrients, you can see how these issues may arise. So while I could say a lot more about the topic of nutrition and ADHD, I would like to add at least one other important note. You may have heard about the role of omega-3s or fish oils in reducing inflammation in the body and having a generally positive impact on mood and conditions like ADHD. This is a topic that is at least as complex, if not more so, than that of micronutrients. Studies on omega-3 supplementation for ADHD are largely equivocal, with some finding no improvement in symptoms and others finding benefits, which, to be fair, can be said of almost anything that is studied in science. Additionally, some studies indicated that omega-3s enhance the effects of medications like stimulants and antidepressants, meaning that you can have a lower dose with more benefits and fewer side effects. The reasons for mixed study findings are probably quite varied, as with many studies on any given intervention. Some studies that found no positive effect at 3 months found improvement at 6 months, which suggests that it may take some time for these fatty acids to be incorporated into the brain machinery that is implicated in ADHD. Another variable might be the quality of the fish oils used, which can make a big difference too. So here's a very quick overview of why omega-3 fatty acids matter. The brain primarily comprises various types of fats or lipids and cholesterol, as opposed to proteins that might be dominant in, say, heart muscle. The primary unit of the brain function is the neuron, which is essentially just a cell in the brain that is specialized for communicating with other neurons and creating communication networks. All these neurons have a membrane that resembles something like a bubble, housing the cell nucleus DNA, and numerous other bits of cellular machinery. The bubble part that gives the shape its cell is the cell membrane, comprised of the lipids and cholesterol I just mentioned, and a significant number of these lipids are the EPA and DHA omega-3 fatty acids found most abundantly in fish oils. Now, despite the fact that a neuron is so small as to be invisible to the naked eye, there are thousands of receptors embedded in the cell membrane, just in one cell membrane. In fact, neurons are so small that we have approximately 80 billion of them in the brain, and yet none of them make physical contact with each other. You probably know someone that believes they only have 500 neurons in their brain, but I digress. The receptors are so named because they receive the active molecules, such as dopamine, that enable its effects without the receptors. Dopamine is just floating around between cells and not really doing anything useful. The space outside and between brain cells is swimming with chemicals. Neurotransmitters such as dopamine that dock onto or fit onto the dopamine receptors. And when this docking occurs, it activates other processes in the brain or in the brain cell that relate to dopamine functions such as motivation and reward processes. Just as I said earlier about proteins being involved in producing dopamine, so too are these proteins dependent on gene expression, which is again nutrient dependent, and is perhaps half of the equation when we talk about dopamine levels in the brain. Lots of dopamine without receptors to bind negates the effects of having large amounts of dopamine in the first place. It is like having 100 copies of your front door key, but the lock itself is jammed. You still can't unlock the door. So omega-3 fatty acids can only be obtained from food, so deficiencies can definitely arise with a poor diet. The makeup of fatty acids that compromise the membrane partly organizes how the embedded proteins are oriented. You could think of this as a tree that is planted in soil with the right texture. If the soil were really watery and soupy, the tree wouldn't be able to take root and stand upright, or would just blow over in the faintest of wind. If the soil was set like concrete, the roots wouldn't be able to reach down and extract the nutrients and the water from the tree. The proteins in the cell membrane are similar in that they are planted in and correctly orient or reach out into the environment to interact with chemicals like dopamine. The wrong type of fatty acids, such as the preponderance of omega-6s or hydrogenated vegetable oils or even omega-3s that have been damaged at the molecular level by oxidation, are analogous to the example of the poor soil that does not allow trees or plants to grow properly. So it's a complex system, but maybe now you can see how little it has to do with the relatively simple concept of raising dopamine in some parts of the brain. The final aspect of nutrition I will discuss is oxidative stress or free radical damage. This is also a complicated issue about which entire books can be written. Still, I will keep it as simple as I possibly can because at a practical level, it is very relevant to mood and cognitive functioning. Free radicals, also known as reactive oxygen species or ROS, are mostly natural byproducts of biological processes in the body, much like exhaust fumes from a combustion engine. There are also less natural causes such as exposure to radiation, excessive UV light, excessive exercise, and excess stress in general. And unfortunately, processed foods, seed oils, alcohol, and stimulants. Molecules like to have a stable chemical arrangement, such that electrons in an atom's orbit are paired together. However, many reactive oxygen species have unpaired electrons, and they will steal an electron from another molecule to rebalance the unpaired electron. This, however, creates a domino effect, as the molecule that had its electron stolen is now unbalanced and may itself steal an electron from somewhere else to rebalance itself. An analogy that may help this make sense is if you look at rusted metal. The iron interacts with oxygen, changing the molecular shape of iron molecules over time. Rust may seem inconsequential at low levels, but after a while, the metal is structurally weakened, and edges that were once smooth and safe to handle can become jagged, sharp, and injure you. Similarly, high levels of ROS activity damage proteins like the molecules involved in dopamine production and communication They damage the lipids and the fats, such as the cell membrane that anchors the proteins and the DNA itself. This is not to say that ROSs are bad. At the right level, they actually form a crucial part of the immune system. It's just that when ROS activity overwhelms antioxidant activity, that they become toxic. As you may know, since antioxidants are a bit of a buzzword, they are essentially molecules that can donate electrons without themselves sustaining damage and can neutralize free radicals in other ways. There are many food sources of antioxidants, such as fresh fruits and vegetables and green tea, but some unexpected sources include foods like beef liver because it supports the methylation cycle, which supports glutathione production, which is known as the master antioxidant of the body. In terms of what causes and accelerates ROS activity, in children with ADHD, one of the primary culprits is likely to be sugar. And when I say sugar, I don't just mean the white powdery stuff, but also processed carbohydrates and fruit juices, which are generally metabolized into sugars. Folks in industrialized nations today are consuming orders of magnitude more sugar than our grandparents and great-grandparents' generations. To keep it brief, sugar, especially in the context of the foods that is often packaged in for kids, like the refined cereals with questionable ingredients and synthetic flavors and colors, can definitely tilt the balance towards ROS dominance. Additionally, sugar and processed foods harm the gut, or the gut microbiome over time, and there is a pretty clear connection between a healthy gut microbiome that is nourished by foods in their natural state and happy, healthy, stable moods, and cognition too, and an unhealthy microbiome that is fueled by processed foods and mood and behavioral dysfunction. By the way, just to be clear, I am not vilifying carbohydrates or the use of some sugar, especially when in the context of high levels of activity and exercise, or some of the healthiest forms of natural carbohydrates. This is just about the gross imbalance that exists in modern society and the massive bias towards high intake of refined sugars. If your child is eating sugary high carbohydrate breakfasts or meals in general, you may want to consider experimenting with a meal that is higher in good quality proteins and natural fats. I'm not advocating for any specific eating plan here. The topic is just too big. But something like eggs cooked in butter with avocado and blueberries is an example of what I'd consider a micronutrient-dense breakfast that has an array of nutrients that support brain health, is very low glycemic, and will maybe completely prevent blood sugar and insulin spikes, and will likely be satiating for many hours longer than any processed food would be. And lastly, a final note about antioxidants. Some studies show that natural products like pine bark extract and ginger extract can improve symptoms of ADHD. As always with studies, some show no effect. My guess is that these supplements can and do work, but the nuance is in knowing that ADHD is not a pine bark or ginger deficiency, obviously. These compounds don't work directly on dopaminergic pathways in the brain. They have antioxidant qualities that may help by reducing the free radical activity in the brain and in the nervous system, but how well they work is largely going to be a function of whether or not that is the primary issue in the etiology of ADHD or it is some other issue. There is seldom a simple cause and effect relationship in biology, and a holistic and integrative approach that supports the entire organism, not just a subset of that organism, is more likely to be effective. So to summarize, if you are considering stimulant medications for you or for your child, or your child is currently on stimulant meds but struggling with compliance, or there are concerning side effects, you may want to consider addressing the points I have raised in this video. If anything, they would likely enhance the effectiveness of the medication, and you may need less of it for a shorter duration. I'm definitely not prescribing anything here, but these are topics to dig into further on your own and bring up maybe for discussion with any mental health providers you may be working with, or pediatrician, or so on. So, yep, that's about it. Please let me know in the comments if you have any questions, or if you'd like me to do some separate follow-up videos that elaborate further on what I've tried to present briefly here. All right, cool. Thank you for watching.